Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear experts talk about their work, their experience, and their research into human performance, particularly as it relates to motor learning and crisis decision-making. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and my name is Chris Butler, and I'm your host for today. And it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Rob Gray from Arizona State University. Originally from Toronto, Canada, Rob completed his BA in psychology at Queen's University and his MS and PhD in experimental psychology at York University. After receiving his PhD in 1998, he worked as a research scientist for the Nissan Motor Corporation in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 2001, he was appointed as assistant professor in the newly formed applied psychology program at Arizona State University. In 2006, Rob was appointed the associate professor and program head. Since 2005, he has worked part-time as research psychologist for the United States Air Force. From January to June of 2010, he was appointed as visiting professor in sports science at the University of the Mediterranean in France. From 2010 to 2014, Rob was the associate professor in perception action in the School of Sport, Exercise, and Rehabilitation at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. His research focuses on perceptual motor control with a particular emphasis on the demanding actions involved in driving, aviation, and sport. His goal is to conduct basic research that can be applied towards the improvement of training, simulation, accident prevention, and human-machine interface development within these contexts. In 2007, Rob was awarded the Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contribution to Psychology from the American Psychological Association. And the Earl Alusi Award, Rob, you will correct me if I pronounce that incorrectly.
I think that's right.
For early career achievement in the field of applied experimental and engineering psychology. In 2015, Rob started the Perception and Action podcast. This podcast explores how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing new technologies in sport and other high-performance domains. It covers disciplines, including sports science, psychology, human systems engineering, sport analytics, human factors, neuroscience, and cognitive science. The podcast reviews basic concepts and discusses the latest research in these areas. It is targeted at academics, researchers, coaches, performance analysts, technology developers, and students working and studying in these areas. You can find the Perception Action podcast at perceptionaction.com. Dr. Gray is also the author of How We Learn to Move, a revolution in the way we coach and practice sports skills. How We Learn to Move examines exciting and alternative approaches to learning movement skills and its implications for practice design, coaching, keeping students engaged in sport, the prevention of injury, developing training technology, and using performance analytics. Well, welcome, Dr. Gray, to the Trainer's Bullpen. Thank you for taking the time to join us today.
You're my pleasure, Chris. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so, one of the things I so appreciate about you, Rob, is, and as I've mentioned, I've been following your podcast and Perception Action for well over a year now. But I love the way that you take research papers and studying different aspects of human performance and can break it down in a way that, especially somebody like me and the average law enforcement officer that doesn't have a background in research, in kinesiology, in these human performance domains, you really help us understand that. And so when I read this paper that you're going to help us understand today, it's called There Must Be an Ideal Solution, Assessing Training Methods of Knife Defense Performance of Police Recruits. Now, this is a study that Corner and Stoller and Keck did, and it was published in Policing and International Journal of Police Strategies and Management in 2020. But one of the things that they looked at, and you're going to help us understand, was basically two different training approaches, a linear approach and a nonlinear approach. Mm-hmm. And they found some pretty important findings that I think have implications for law enforcement training. So Rob, That's why I asked
Yeah.
you to come and
Mhm.
help us understand that.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Yes. Sometimes these journal articles are really written for people that are working in that area. They're not written for a kind of outside audience. So, yeah, I try, I think yeah, best I can, I try to break it down for people.
Yeah, and thank you for doing that too, because that's so important because especially in law enforcement, the interdisciplinary domains, Rob, have such important, they've done
Mhm.
such important work and they have such important understanding that can really help advance law enforcement training. But again, it's almost like it hits the glass ceiling because of the way it's written for academia.
Mhm.
It doesn't penetrate down into the applied part of law enforcement training. So thank you for doing that. Let's take a look at this study, Rob.
Mhm.
What can you tell us about what were the researchers exploring? What were they examining, and what were their research questions?
Yeah, so they basically, I think their goal was to try to apply a methodology, a kind of this new that I wrote about in my book, some that's kind of being applied in a lot of sports and other domains, and kind of a different way of looking at skill acquisition to the defense kind of police training avenue. So seeing if you get kind of similar effects for how we see in sports and with athletes in this kind of domain. And the main, so they're really kind of contrasting the very traditional approach to way you teach these kind of skills with this kind of what sometimes people call the ecological or nonlinear approach. Right.
Okay, fantastic. So, and as we get into it, I'm really going to ask you to sort of describe that
Mhm.
ecological or
Sure.
nonlinear
Mhm.
approach. But one of the things that the terms that we see used in this paper repeatedly is this word pedagogical.
Mhm.
And so or pedagogy, and that may be an unfamiliar term for most law enforcement trainers. So Rob, what do they mean by that?
Yeah, basically, pedagogy is really just being used to talk about instruction or teaching. People might get mad at me that are actually research in the area, but it's kind of using $100 word when a $1 word would do, right? It's yeah, how do you instruct people? So pedagogy refers to instruction, and there's more to it than that, but for this purpose, the same, yeah, yeah.
Okay, and so this paper, then they were looking at those two different instructional techniques,
Hmm.
traditional, and you said traditional kind of uh,
Hmm.
linear, and
Hmm.
we'll talk about that. Well, maybe right now is a good time to address that issue. So linear and nonlinear, can you describe what each of those means, and then maybe help the listeners by giving examples, even from a sports domain, from your experience? What would a linear versus a nonlinear environment look like?
Yeah, so linear, the reason it's kind of use that term, so linear means like straight line. Like, so if I was explaining skill, I could put the parts on like a line where so like in defense, right? I perceive what the person is doing. I wanted that I decide what I need to do to stop them, and then I execute the movement to stop them. So I perceive they're holding a knife. I decide I need to they're attacking me with a knife. I decide I need to block with my arm. I pull out of my memory the program for blocking, right? So the idea that these things happen in order, one after another along a line. And the idea is that the way I get better, because of that, I can break them apart. Like, so I can take the movement, the technique of blocking, and just work on that with no actual real opponent that's trying to attack me or anything. And I work on that over and over again. And then when I put you back in, then next I will get you to work against an opponent and decide when to use that. So, like a sporting analogy, in soccer, right? You need to be able to, if I want to get around an opponent with the ball, dribble around them. What I need to do first is to teach you how to handle the ball. So I'll have you dribble around cones first, to make it easier. So there's no opponent there. You get really good. I'll have you another kind of fundamental idea of this is repetition, right? I'm going to get you to repeat this technique over and over and over till you get good at that. Then I'll put you in a game and you'll just be able to pull that out. I see an opponent in front of me. I'll pull out the dribbling from my memory and get around them. So it's kind of that's linear pedagogy. Non-linear pedagogy is really the idea that all these things are happening at the same time and you can't break them apart, right? So I'm perceiving and acting and deciding all at the same time. So I can really I can't pull apart a skill, repeat it, break it, develop it, and then put it back in. It has to stay in context, right? So teaching you the movement to block something, a punch or a knife attack, when there's no actual opponent, that's, it can't just be put back in later on because it doesn't occur in a straight line like that. So that's the basic idea of the nonlinear versus linear.
Okay, so let me give you an example of a typical law enforcement training of say defending against a knife attack or a punch. Is often what you will see, Rob, is you'll have all the students in a line, and you'll have other students who are playing the role of attacker, and the instructor will direct that say a right cross punch or a right roundhouse punch is going to come, and it will come, and the students have been taught this is the block, this is the wrap, this is the this, and it's broken down like that. So it's very scripted and typically very technique based, where they're told, you want the outside of your forearms to block, your hands are open, your fingers are splayed, and some will even get it detailed about the angle of the elbow, what it should look like and all that. So even though there's an opponent, a so-called opponent, is that still closer to linear or is it non-linear?
Yeah, that's very close to linear. The idea, another essential idea in linear, and that's where this title of the paper comes from here, right? There must be an ideal solution, is that there's one correct way to block, right? That I'm going to teach you. And I'm going to tell you all the mechanics of it, like keep your arms up, do this and you're going to repeat it over and over. That's the way we become skillful, right? In the nonlinear view, it's really, there's no one correct way to do it. The way to do it depends on the individual, but also, right, there's no one punch, right? The punch can be high, low, and what about if the person kicks, right? I had to be able, also, like I get punched at from different distances when my body's different in position. So nonlinear argues there's not one correct way to actually do a particular skill. Skill is about picking up information in the moment and adapting your movement to it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I wonder too, as I often reflect on how many years I've spent doing linear training in the law enforcement realm, is, when you think about an officer on the street that's confronted by a sudden spontaneous attack at close range, we wouldn't want that officer waiting until the threat is so fully developed that before they start to act. Like ideally, we would want them to have great game intelligence where they can read those early cues, those biomechanics, and learn to start taking action well before that is developed. So do you think that linear training, like I've described, can it actually impair performance by what we call training scars in law enforcement? Is through repetition in a linear world, we Hebbianize this conditioned response where the performance is actually not the optimal of what we would want on the street.
Yeah, I think so. I think this overly focus on the technique and the repetition of the perfect technique, what you often find is when you put the person in the actual situation, they don't know when to use it, right? They don't know how to adjust it. Like, what do I do when the person's left-handed, right? And the punch is coming from a different angle. You kind of lose, you can't just plug it in like that. And, go back to my soccer example, like you see tons of kids that are incredibly gifted at like doing these technical things on the side of the field, keeping the ball up in the air. And then you put them in the game and they're terrible. They don't know when to pass, shoot, drive by their opponent because there's so little decision making. Like that's another kind of big problem with linear training is there's so little decision making involved, right? What you described in your activity, you're telling the athlete, you're telling the person, this person's going to punch and you have to block. There's no decision on their part about what to do. And then you get them in a complex environment where they don't know what can happen and they make the wrong decision and we wonder why, right? Because we didn't give any practice at that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I guess it's not so much that it can hurt. It can in some sense, but it's the idea that it's really not the most efficient use of kind of practice time, right? We're spending so much time worrying about the technical when we're not, teaching the other parts of it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's look at the study design, Rob. Why don't you walk us through that? How did they carry out the study? I know before we started hit the record button, you began to tell me a bit about some of the
Yeah.
methodology that maybe could have been a little bit better, but why don't you tell us about the study design and
Yeah, so I think this was a study that happened was in Germany, and they took police recruits. I think in the end they ended up with 20, and they put them into split them into two kind of training groups, and they did kind of the standard thing we do in research called a pre-post design. So we're going to assess you on a bunch of abilities before training, train you for a while, then assess you on the same abilities afterwards to see if there's any change. So the pre-test is that happens before, the post-test happens after. And what they did in the study was the tests were they had people blocking different knife attacks, right? Different kind of so they had ones. It was interesting. They had ones both where they told the person what was going to happen, like this person's. I can't remember what exactly they're going to thrust at you, and they measured how often the person got hit, how quickly they blocked. But like one of the key conditions they had though in the study that I really liked is they had a surprise attack, right? Where the police recruit didn't know what the attack was going to be. And that's important because that's where you expect the non-linear approach to really shine, right? The non-linear approach is going to make you adaptable and adjustable to things you not trained for. And so that's where we would expect the biggest difference, right? So yeah, so that's basically what they did. And then they had 3 weeks of training. The I think the linear group was, like you said, the very the other kind of one of the other differences between the two is in linear teaching methods, right? The idea is the instructor knows all the answers, right? As a recruit, I'm coming to you because you're going to tell me exactly how to do it, right? That's why I call you. You're going to instruct me in the correct way. And so in the linear group in the study, that's exactly what they did, right? They told them, gave them like cues about what their body should be doing. I had an example here, they're giving them like specific instructions about how to do different types of blocks, doing these different kind of things. So for example, one of their cues was for inside defense, bend the elbow at an angle between 90 and 120 degrees and rotate the hip. Right. So they're giving the instructor is giving the solution to the recruit. Here's what you do when this happens, right? So that was the linear group. In a nonlinear, and the other ways, we kind of changed the way how we think of the coach as more of a designer and guide. So the fundamental assumption is the coach doesn't know exactly the best way to do it, right? Because it's going to depend on the situation, the individual. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create practice for you to figure out how to do it on your own, right? So in this study, what they did was they instead of doing lots of instruction and isolated repeats of these movements, right? They had they call it what do they call it? Dynamic chaos. So they were constantly sparring with other people, And then, different attacks from different positions. They were kind of varying things. So they really did not do any, as far as I can tell, they just told them don't get hit, create distance from your opponent. They didn't tell them anything about how to stop any of the attacks. So they didn't give them any explicit instructions about how to move, right? And they just kind of let them explore through things. And as I said, this is so maybe I'll stop there and I'll let you kind of if there's any kind of points.
Yeah, no, I thank you.
Yeah.
So in that, then, is that normal in like a non-linear training approach to not give any instruction at all? Or would you still want to, like, you'd want your performers to know basic goals and principles?
Mhm.
Maybe not the technique of how to get there, but like, what's the goal and principle of being successful in this environment? Is that right?
Yeah. So it is on yes, on the one hand, we don't really in the nonlinear approach, we don't really give any instructions at all about how to we're giving you problems to solve, not solutions. We want you to figure out the solution. But at the same time, like I think I were talking to you before we started recording, I don't think this is the best example of a nonlinear approach because one of the things kind of confusions people have about this is that they think nonlinear just means letting you do it on your own with no kind of guidance. Like going back to my soccer example, okay, dribbling around the cones doesn't work. Okay, just let them play a whole bunch of games. Like and I'm not going to say anything at all. That's really not what the nonlinear approach is. In particular, they mentioned this term called the constraints-led approach. A nonlinear approach, what I'm going to do is keep the thing more realistic. Like I'm going to have you sparring, but I'm going to add things to try to help guide you to more effective techniques, right? So, maybe if this was more of a martial arts, maybe I'm seeing as a coach, I'm seeing that you're always trying to grab the person's head to pull them down to the ground. Um, and that's not really working well. I'll add what I call a constraint. I'll say, okay, there's a rule, no grabbing over the head. Or I'll tell their opponent, all right, lean way back, right? So I'm like changing the structure of practice to kind of get you to try different things. So it's not just letting people do whatever they want. That's kind of the misconception about this approach. As a coach, you're stepping in and you're saying, or you even might do it like, okay, try getting closer to them, or try putting your left, even a little bit of instruction. So usually there's more to it than this study, which was kind of just letting people fight with some variation, right? Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen really good trainers do in law enforcement, say when we're teaching balance displacement
Mhm.
takedowns, is they will educate the students about balance, about the vestibular system and how balance works and how you disrupt balance, but they
Mhm.
won't give them any specific instructions about this is how you do it and how you do it. It's
Yeah.
all now they have to self-organize based upon the context to apply those goals and principles. So
Yeah.
would that type of approach still be consistent with
Exactly. And you used
nonlinear?
a key term there, self-organized. So I want you to figure it out. But as a coach, I'm going to kind of push and, pull, guide you, change the way practice is designed. So, um, another, if I want to flip someone over that's kind of on the ground or something, I might have the person be a wider stance, right? So you have to kind of do a different maneuver. So yeah, that's exactly. I'm letting the athlete figure out these things on their own, but as a coach, I'm guiding, in changing the practice to help kind of push, show them, okay, this is a good might work, help, right? Um, but another kind of difference, and you see it in here is Bruce Lee used to have this term he used, keep making practice alive, right? What we're trying to do is that's where the term ecological comes from. We want to keep everything in context, where you're actually sparring against a resisting opponent, right? Um, a lot of the kind of linear drills one of the things I tell people is when you switch to using kind of nonlinear approach, the sound in your gym will be totally different. When people do blocking of repetitive kind of things they know are coming, it's kind of very right, versus when they don't know what their opponent's doing and there's all this unpredictability, everything gets louder. It's more chaotic, and people get more into it. So that's what I think he meant by being alive.
Yeah.
But yeah, so overall I think I think it was a good basic first start of it, but I think I would have done some other different things in the nonlinear group to help guide them. You know, that's a really misconception. I like to like it. We still need your knowledge as an instructor to know what is a good way to block a knife. It doesn't mean you can just do anything, right? There's certain things that are not going to work, and we still want you as a coach to step in and okay, let's help guide you a bit. It's just we don't want you to tell exactly how to do it from the start. Yeah, but it still requires really good skill from the coach. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. And so, Rob, in this study, the retention period, I believe, was 8 weeks. So,
Yeah.
a couple of questions on that. Can you help us understand, like, what is the importance of a retention period? Why do researchers use that to look at
Mhm.
learning? And then is 8 weeks, in your opinion, is that a good retention period? Is there a standard retention period, or what do you typically see?
Yeah, so the retention it is really important, I think, because I often see this in my own coaching. The term I use is you want these skills to be sticky, right? You want them to stay around. Like it's very easy in a practice environment, well, relatively easy to get someone to do a certain thing. Okay, keep your hands up, when you're fighting. But when they go away into the actual environment or a few weeks, they go back to what they were doing before they dropped their hands. Sorry, I'm doing demonstrations in the audio. So it's very easy for things to disappear when people walk out of the practice. We see that all the time. So retention is measuring, is it sticking? Is what we're doing, keeping what they've learned around. And 8 weeks for research, it doesn't sound like very long, but for research, it's actually quite good. A lot of them are like 24 hours. That's actually quite a long time in terms of research. It's just in doing research studies, there's kind of a practical thing. If you let people go away for too long, it's hard to get them back sometimes in your studies. So it's more a practical thing when they have short, but so that is a pretty good length of time.
I guess that's one of the advantages to doing research with law enforcement officers is
Yes.
if the boss tells them they're coming back after 8 weeks, they're coming back after 8 weeks.
Exactly. I had a similar one when we were doing with pilot. Yeah, we did one with the Air Force pilots. They were pretty. There wasn't much doubt of whether they were going to come back or not for your study. Yeah.
So, Rob, with motor learning, then, like I've understood it to be, and you can correct me, but I've understood like the only real measure of whether motor learning has taken place is retention and transfer. So, have they retained the skill post training, and then does that skill transfer? And
Mhm.
does A, so is that accurate? And B, does transfer mean that from the training environment into a novel environment? Is that meaning that skill transfers from one to the other?
Yeah, that's usually what we mean by it. Yeah, that is typically because often you find is the things that work in the short term are not the best for the long term. And there's this classic kind of effect in motor learning. We talk about random versus blocked practice. When you block practice is when you practice the same skill over and over and over again. Like in basketball, if I do a whole bunch of free throws all over and over again, what you find is people will get really better quickly, right, at the shots versus random practice was where I get you shoot from the free throw line, then 10 feet, then 12 feet away, then 30 feet, and I'm randomizing the conditions. What you find is that people struggle with getting better there because there's so much variation going on and they have to adjust their shot and all the time. But then if you measure later on, the people that did the random practice are usually better at retention. And what they're particularly good at is if you make them take a shot from a distance that neither person did in practice, they're way better because they've learned how to adjust their shot for different distances, whereas the other person in the block group just didn't learn how to make free throws, right? So, so the conditions of what happens while you're training don't always predict what's going to happen in the long run and what happens when we put you in other conditions, right? And they actually had an interesting thing in this study that kind of goes along with this. They measured people's kind of perceived confidence, right? So they asked people, how well do you think you're doing? How well do you think you're learning the skill? And what you often find is people in the linear, kind of repetitive, blocked groups think they're doing better, right? Because they're making more shots. Whereas the people in the non-linear, random, they think, oh man, I'm really struggling. I can't do that. Like, so they're not really good at assessing how well they're actually learning. And I always say, like, to learn, you have to fail a certain amount of time. That's when we learn. You have to make mistakes. And when we do that, we don't feel good. We don't feel like we're doing well, but you actually are. We're doing way better than if you did. You're learning a lot more than if you're doing everything perfectly. Like when you do everything perfectly, you don't learn anything. You're just performing, not learning. Yeah. So yes, for sure. Retention and transfer, that's really what we want. We want it to stick and we want it to work in other conditions.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for clarifying that. Now, one of the things that the authors state here, and it's on page 4 of the study, is they state that the main pedagogical problems for current law enforcement training, at least at the State Academy in Germany, in which they studied, were two things. They said piecemeal and disjointed training and simple mimicry or imitation of the trainers by the students. So, Rob, what's the concern? What's the problem with these two issues from a motor learning perspective? Why would learning be impaired when training looks like that?
Yeah, so the first one, I definitely, I think I agree with, when you break it apart and piecemeal training, you get the problems like I mentioned before. You don't know how to actually use it, and when to use it, and how to adjust it. When you focus on the isolated technique, you have those kind of problems. The imitation one that's an interesting point. Demonstration is actually a really good tool. The only thing I think they could be referring to is like, if I'm getting you to do a block when you're not actually blocking a real serious punch, you might just get the kind of superficial aspects of it without actually, like if I told you to watch me swing a baseball bat and swing it like me without actually hitting a high speed pitch, you might just get the basic, aesthetics of it without actually learning how to control the actual movement and adjust it. So I think that's what they're referring to there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on page 6 of the paper, the researchers discuss nonlinear training methods, and they state that the important supporting premise for nonlinear training is that human behavior in the real world is non-linear. And as soon as I read that, my mind went to your book that I've been reading. And it's like we live in an ecological world that is completely non-linear. So this is precisely one of the areas of your expertise and research focus, Rob. So can you expand on the importance of this relationship between performance in the real world and how that should impact our training methodology?
Yeah. So it really goes back to this kind of idea of the one correct movement. Now, I'll give you an example that kind of fits with some of their discussion here, right? So what they're saying here is that a lot of people believe the problem with one of the real issues in training is that recruits are not getting enough reps to practice that technique. And one of the big researchers in the ecological approach is Nikolai Bernstein, who's a Russian physiologist, and he was hired by the Soviet Union of Labor to work with blacksmiths, right? And what they had some blacksmiths that were really not very good at like cutting metal and doing these different things. And they had some that were great. And the assumption was the same one that I just discussed. The idea is the lesser skilled ones hadn't learned to repeat the one hammering movement, the one correct way to do it. They just needed more reps. And what Bernstein did was actually measure the movements of skilled and lesser skilled. And what he found was the expert one doesn't swing the hammer the same way every time. He traced the movement and he shows they use slightly different angles, slightly different movements. And so one of the key ideas in the ecological approach is that the environment around you and inside you is always changing, right? So what direction I'm getting attacked from, the height of the attacker, whether I'm fatigued or not. Well, it's never the same. So I can't have just one solution. I need lots of different solutions to effectively defend myself. So there's not one way to do things. I need to be able to vary my movements in an appropriate way. That's
Okay.
really kind of the fundamental idea. Yeah.
All right. So can I unpack that a little bit more?
Sure.
Ask you to. So in the example that you gave then with the blacksmith, so they're able, so the repetition, the success in repetition is the success in being able to replicate a successful outcome every time.
Mhm.
But the way they got there was not through the repetition of the same technique
Exactly.
every time.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Sometimes
what,
you'll hear the expression repetition without repetition. Repeating the
okay.
outcome without repeating the movement that got you there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because as a firearms instructor, one of the things that we do a lot is we focus on precise biomechanics of a draw stroke. So the elbow needs to go like this, the grip needs to look like that, the angle of the wrist needs to look like this, and we go through a lot of pains to describe a biomechanical technique, and we get the students to replicate that. But then what I noticed is when we're on the static firearms range and they can do that, they take great pains to try to replicate exactly what the trainer told them to do. But now as soon as we put them in drills, like ecologically realistic drills and even scenarios, we don't see that performance.
Yeah.
They're still able to get the gun out very quickly and efficiently. So they reach the same end state, but the biomechanics is completely different than what we have tried to drill into them on the range. So, maybe this is the wrong approach because, if what you're saying here is the self-importance of self-organization and organizing your own movement to be able to be successful, then the officer should be able to get that gun out, whether they're standing still, whether they're running, whether they're falling backwards, whether they're on the ground. They should still be able to get very quickly and efficiently to the same endpoint, correct?
Yes, exactly. And the idea is you cannot possibly teach them all the variants of all the correct movement for all those variants of like all you can do is help them learn to do it themselves, right? They're gonna have to make the adjustment when I'm when I'm running, how do I adjust my movement pattern, taking that into account, right? So but we tend to focus on this, one ideal when I'm just standing still and everything's perfect. And then they get out in conditions and can't handle the variations. Yeah.
Okay. And Rob, what about the inherent uniqueness of every human being and how they move? Does that have to be considered? Because how I draw my firearm in a certain way and my movement patterns, my biomechanics may not be anywhere near the same as the next student and the next student. They all may move slightly differently just because of the incredible milieu of being different people.
Yeah.
So
100%. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. You have different, grip strength, different arm length, different, all of those things are going to affect. And, the idea, the idea, that there's only one way to do it, even at elite level, like, for example, you could take, like in tennis, I could take Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer, and I could just show you their shadows, and you could tell me which one is which, right? They have a unique way they move. There's not just one way to be an elite tennis player, right? They've come up with a way that works for them based on their own. Sometimes we call these individual constraints, right? Your own body dimensions, your own capacities, and so on. So yeah, we need to kind of take those into account and move away from the idea there's one size fits all kind of technique. Yeah.
Okay, and so in the constraints-led approach to training, then when you use the phrase the performer constraint, so would that
Mm.
be one of those aspects of recognizing that each performer has different characteristics?
Exactly. Yeah, we got to kind of let them find what works for them. Yeah, there's certain, obviously this is again, not, you can't do just anything. There's certain, you need to get the gun out in a way that's, under control, so there's certain requirements we have to meet still, but there's different ways we can within that. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we started to mention constraints-led approach or CLA, and as you know, the researchers spent a lot of ink in this study talking
Mhm.
about the constraints-led approach. So I would assume that
Mhm.
most of the officers who are going to watch this interview, this will be new terminology for them.
Mhm.
So help us understand, Rob, what is a constraints-led approach? And I think it's sort of a new, could we call it a revolution in training? I don't know if it's like the concept isn't new, but the
Mhm.
application of it might be.
I think so. Yeah. I think it's people have been using the basic ideas for a long time, right? It's just kind of putting it all together and under a theory. Yeah, the idea is with the reason the constraint is a weird name, right? Yeah, you constrain someone so they get better. Sounds weird, right? It sounds like I'm limiting you. The idea is that, um, so in any situation, right? So if someone was punching me, to defend myself, I have lots of different options. Like I could block with my left hand, right hand, I could step back out of the way, duck, right? So I have all these alternatives. And sometimes for a new learner, it can be hard to know, what do I do? Which one do I use? If I'm going to block, do I just use my arms straight or do I bend my wrists? Right? There's so many options with the human body. A constraint is something that takes away some of those options, right? It takes away some of their options and this not only helps the person kind of figure out what to do, as an instructor, you can push someone to try something different, right? So say I was always jumping out of the way, trying to move out of the way of a punch, right? As an instructor, I can add the constraint of a smaller area we're fighting in. So I've taken away that solution of backing up because I want you to learn how to block, right? Or I can constrain by, saying you're only allowed to use your right hand. Or I can put in a piece of something on the floor you have to step over. So the constraints that approach is what can I add to practice to kind of take away what the person's doing now and make them try something else. So I'm taking away some sort of aspect of their movement and getting them to try to explore another solution. That's why we call it that. Mhm.
Okay, so examples of that. So there's three aspects in the CLA, right? There's
Mm.
three things that the coach or the trainer can modify. You
Mhm.
can modify the performer, you can modify the task, and you can modify the environment, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are the three aspects. So in as a trainer, then as I think about whatever skill I'm teaching my officers, and you gave a great example of maybe I'm going to inhibit one limb, so now they only have one
Mhm.
arm. That's changing the performer constraint, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The kind of the what the individual can do. Or sometimes we could consider that task. Now you have to block with just one arm. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, in the like an example of the environment, when I use them, like I work a lot in baseball, so I get You know, sometimes baseball pitchers will land on the, when they land on the front foot, they kind of roll a bit, which I don't want them to do. So what I'll do is I put them in sand, like a sandbox, and when they land now, they almost fall over. So I've changed the environment to try to discourage that movement. But critically, in the constraint set approach, I'm not telling you what to do instead, right? If I take away your left arm, I'm not telling you how to block with your right. You got to self-organize and figure that out on your own. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And other things that would be easy to do. So the goal is, like with the CLA approach, is to make it as ecologically rich as possible, right?
Yeah.
Like, so, we in law enforcement, we can change the lighting, for example, if we're doing combatives in a training
Yeah.
environment, we could dim the lighting to constrain the
Mhm.
vision. We could even make it pitch black because officers have to function in
Mhm.
low light and no light conditions. We could replicate a freeway where they're getting in a ground fight beside a car, but now they can't go into
Yeah.
oncoming lanes. They've
Yeah,
got
you
to,
can't go left. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
they can't, they've got to fix the
Mhm.
problem in this very constrained
Mhm.
space. What about changing the physiology of the performer? And what I mean by that is, can would it be appropriate to say push them physiologically, maybe with some type of a high intensity drill to get heart rate and physiology up, and then put them? So
For sure. Yeah. That's one of my favorite things to do, like get you fatigued in some way, running laps or doing some weight exercise now, fight. Because now you have to adapt to this new, you're tired and you can't move as quickly maybe. So yeah, for sure. That's another, it's not one we do enough, I don't think. I think it's a good tool. Mhm.
well, and this is an area that I'd like, if when we do another interview, I would like us to just focus on the constraints-led approach and
Mhm.
really dig into that so our trainers can understand what that is and how they can
For
apply
sure.
it in the
Mhm.
training environment. So next thing I want to ask you about, they talked about something I found very interesting, and this is that they said the linear approach resulted in an internal focus of attention,
Mhm.
whereas the nonlinear training approach resulted in an external focus of attention. So, a bunch of questions there, Rob. Why do we care about internal versus external focus of attention? What's the relationship between that and learning? Help us understand that.
Yeah. So internal focus of attention means basically I'm focusing on my body during the execution of my movement. Like, so when they say bend your elbow at 90 degrees, that's creating an internal focus. I'm focusing on what my elbow is doing. And the external focus is focusing more on the environment, what effect my movement is having on the environment. So hit the bag hard is an external cue. You're focusing on the punching bag. Don't let the opponent get close is external. And there's a very long, actually almost 25 years of research now. It's one of the most kind of consistent findings in motor learning that you learn better when you focus externally. Kind of when you focus too much on your body, that's one of the things that we think happens when people fail under pressure, right? When you get under pressure, you start worrying about, oh, am my feet the right width apart? And you don't want to do that. You want to just let your body kind of go on its own. You want to focus on what's happening out there and let your body sort out the details of how to do it. So yeah, so in general, they're getting people to focus on and you can think in linear, that's what we do all the time because we're talking about technique. We're talking about all about what your body is doing. And so we're really getting person to focus internally. And as I said, in general, that's not good for performance and learning. Mhm.
This is one of the aspects of firearms training that you will see is, especially when we're first getting the students to learn the draw stroke, learn how to shoot the gun, is we get their attention to think about, so what that feels like in your hand, where your hand is on the weapon, think about where your finger is on the trigger and the pressure on the trigger. and it's very internally
Mhm.
focused. Is there a place when you're first learning a new skill? Is there a place at all for an internal focus of attention? And if there is, when should we shift from internal to external?
Yeah, you'll get a little bit of differing opinion on this. In general, I think as much as possible you want to do it externally. You want to get the person focusing outward, and even when they're first starting. And we could talk about this more, like you said, when we'll get into the details of constraints. One great way to do that is to try to give them an analogy for how you want them to move. So instead of saying, I want you to bend your elbow 90 degrees and do this, you could say, I want you to move like you're cracking a whip, right? So you get the movement pattern. In basketball, we talk about, I want you, imagine getting a cookie out of the cookie jar on top of the fridge. So instead of saying extend your arm and snap your wrist, I'm using an analogy. I'm not getting you to think about your body at all. So there are ways we can, with even with the novice performance, kind of move away from these
Okay.
bodily focus cues. But yeah, in general, I think it's a good idea as much as we can to get people not thinking about what their body's doing too much. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll be excited to talk with you
Yeah.
more about that. So we're coming up to the end of
Mm.
our time here. So Rob, let's talk about the results of the study.
Mhm.
Why don't you tell us what did the researchers discover? What were the important outcomes from their research?
Yeah, so what they did was they looked, as I said, they looked at the success rate after training, right, in those tests. And what they found were there was kind of compared to the linear group, the nonlinear group in the post-test got hit less, they reacted faster, um, and as kind of I would have predicted even before I say, in particular in the surprise attack they did way, way better than the linear group. They have a nice figure here, looking at they kind of got hit, on hit significantly less, both after training and the retention one. So they showed clear benefits in terms of these tests. You could question whether these tests are really true measure of what happens in the field, but but I think they're showing these clear benefits, and this kind of mirrors a lot of the studies we've seen in sports of the same kind of thing. Um, it help people show greater improvements in when you use this more nonlinear approach, particularly like so their surprise attack is almost like a transfer kind of like it's a condition you didn't really prepare for, and that's when people really shine, right? um the one I work with, for example, in like team sports, I work with some volleyball coaches, and they say they use kind of this nonlinear approach, and they say where you really see it, even when they're playing against a much better team in terms of talent and size, whenever the play breaks down and the ball is kind of going everywhere, they win every one of those points because they're more adaptable. They're not looking for the
Uh,
one solution. There is no solution to that. They have to solve it on the fly. So that's kind of what they saw. So they see these clear benefits at retention, for the and right after training and the retention period for this nonlinear approach.
So I love the example you gave of the sporting event, because for a law enforcement officer on the street, and I like to say every encounter they have is a novel encounter, because
Mm-hmm.
nothing will be exactly, we cannot replicate in training
Mm-mm.
with any precision any encounter that they're going to have on the street. So to use your analogy, the ball's always going everywhere for an
Yeah.
officer.
And that's kind of the like, one of the things we challenge. Like, even if you knew as an instructor what the correct way was to block or do this, think of how many variants you would have to get. Oh, you need one when the light level's low. You need one when you're by highway. Right? You can't possibly give a person all those. They have to be able to figure those out on their own, right? On the fly, like you said. Yeah.
And figuring that out is what we see in this research paper, and consistent with your
Mhm.
research and experience, is that the ecological nonlinear approach to training results in better problem solvers in
Yeah.
novel environments.
Yeah, that's a great term, Chris. I think I like because because what you're doing on the linear approach is giving people solutions. The nonlinear approach is giving people problems, right? So you're not, so that's, it's not surprising they're better problem solvers. You're giving them more to solve in training. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Mhm.
Well, Rob, I think our time is up. I so appreciate you, but is there anything else that you wanted to say about this study or to add before we finish?
No, I think it's like a good, like I said, I think before we start recording, I think we were talking about how kind of ripe I think kind of this police training is for this, at least like trying this approach, right? Maybe it's not the best one for some things, but it is so I think this is a really good first step in kind of explaining the difference in that context and showing how it can be applied, even though I would do it slightly differently, but you can always quibble about some things in every study for sure.
Well, well, that's good, Rob. Maybe this study has tweaked you to go, you know what, maybe I want to do a research study. You've got lots of willing law enforcement agencies around the
Yeah.
University of Arizona who would probably love to
Mhm.
participate in a study. But my friend, I want to thank you for your time. And I would really want to encourage anybody who's watching this to take advantage of the Perception Action podcast. It's rich with information that you can glean out of all of these different aspects of human performance and look to apply them in your training environment. And I would also encourage you to pick up a copy of Dr. Gray's book, How We Learn to Move. I've only gotten into the first or the second chapter of the book, and not because it's a bad read, but to the contrary, I'm just making so many notes and just having those moments of reflection going, oh, wow, I
Yeah.
understand that and how I apply it. So thank you for both of those resources, Dr. Gray. Appreciate
My
it.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you, Chris. And it's really, like I said, I really love trying to take this into new context. So I'm glad you contacted me.
Well, you're very welcome. And I look forward to our next opportunity to talk.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Bye bye.